Hello and welcome. We are here for the What We Don't Include workshop as part of Chapel FM's Writing on Air Festival. We're delighted to be here delivering this workshop. It should be a very, very exciting time. We're going to talk about page poetry and we're going to talk a little bit about spoken word. I'm Mckenna. This is Gregory Morrison.
Hello.
This is Alex Callaghan.
Hello.
We are poets and performers from Leeds, and we are part of a literary affinity group called Bone Down that runs spoken word and creative events. We would like to speak to you today about the craft of poetry and the construction of a poem. We've been thinking about it a lot over the last few weeks, and we love to workshop each other's pieces, encourage creative expression and pushing the boundaries of what a poem can be. So we wanted to share that a little bit with you and talk about it. We want to talk a little bit about form and structure. What happens when you take the meaning away from the words? Is it still a poem? Can it still be read in the same way? Does it still have the same effect? This may all sound very, very confusing to start with, but we are really going to delve into this, and hopefully at the end of it, you can take something away and you can add it into your own work. So the workshop will be split into two parts, like we said, with the first part focusing on page poetry and the second half focusing on performance poetry. The two will feed into each other and we'll talk through examples, get you to do some practical work and have a discussion of the craft. It's going to be fairly informal because we believe that the best work comes from you and isn't dictated by conventions and formalities. We believe that you don't have to know all the technical stuff and the nitty-gritty to be great at writing. You just have to have a passion for it. You have to understand that it can affect people's emotions, and it comes from a place that is inherently you. So relax, chime in if you want to speak about something. We'll have time for questions and everything else, and we can really just enjoy this time together. So first of all, we want to talk about page poetry. Traditionally, when you're constructing a poem, you'll either write it in free verse or you use a standard form and set conventions. So there's a variety of standard forms when it comes to poetries. I'm sure you've read a lot of them. I'm sure you've tried a lot of them out. They may not be for you, but it's a great way to start and to really push yourself if you're actually going to start grappling with what poetry is. In this way, the space around the page is dictated by the type of poetry you're writing. If you're writing a prose poetry piece, for example, you usually have a block of text and the space around that. This space can convey meaning, emotion, and tone. If you're experimenting with form, you'll see a much more of a blank space around the words that'll draw the reader's eye beyond the boundaries of the poem and beyond the words themselves. If we leave gaps between the words, that gap becomes important. It becomes as important as a word that would fill that gap. Once again, this may sound very confusing. We're going to run you through it, don't worry. At the core of what we're saying is when people see a largely empty space on the page, we're going to ask why. What does that mean? Why has the poet chosen to leave that empty space? And conversely, if there's no empty space on the page, if you get large blocks of text, if it fills the boundaries of the page, why has the poet chosen to do that? Poetry on page is intentional. You think about it when you're writing it, and your editor will think about it when you're publishing it. Each decision is intentional, and the reader takes something from it, whether you know you're taking it or not. What can you convey from this setup and the vast amount of blank space? Here, we have a poem. Can everyone see the poem? Take a second and digest the poem. For listeners at home, the poem starts off with the title, Of Course I Don't Mind. There is a large amount of blank space on the page, and in the center of the page is one line. It's just, I feel sad you'll never have children. It's from Ian Humphrey's book Tormentil. Ian is a local writer who is absolutely incredible, does incredible things. This, however, is a very unique page from his book. While he plays with space and form, we don't see this in any of the other pieces. It suggests to you something in line with what the line reads. We're going to ask you some questions now. If you want to answer, feel free to do so. If you don't have any thoughts, that's completely fine. What do you think this means?
To me, it almost feels like there's nothing else to say on that page because both of those sentences are so strong the reader can read everything else that could have been said. So it doesn't need to be on the page, if that makes sense. And it makes that incredibly powerful because it actually says loads about whoever is saying those two sentences, about their values, about their judgments, about loads of different things, about where they might be in that moment. It says so much. It's amazing.
Completely. With poetry, just like with any other form of creative expression, other people may take different things from it. Has anyone else got anything?
Yes, that very large gap after the title of nothingness, it's as though there's a reluctance to speak, and then eventually there is somebody saying something.
I think both responses are incredibly poignant and incredibly truthful to what this piece is trying to say. So I had the pleasure of actually speaking to Ian during his book launch in Leeds for this book, and I asked him specifically about this piece, and his reply was that it speaks to a sense of longing and missing, of bated breath and of pregnancy itself. It's a pregnant pause for the pregnancy his mother, and by association himself, is mourning due to the revelation of his sexuality. This is a response to him telling his mother that he is gay, and this is what she said. So as you can see, there is that sense of it's a hard thing to say. There is a lot to say here, but the one line reads so much. It's so important. So we see that the way that the line is written and the space around it gives so much meaning to the words itself. But we want to take this further. So what we've done here is we have removed the meaning of the words. So each word has a corresponding word of the same syllables as fruit. So one-syllable words become pear, two-syllable words become apple, and three-syllable words become strawberry. So that line will then become pear, 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 apple, pear, strawberry. It's just that I'm sad you'll never have children. From this, we can still see the space around the line. We can still see how stark it is. We can still feel the fact that this is of incredible importance and it's hard to say anything else around this word. If he was to put another line straight after it, do you think that that would take away from the line? Do you think that the meaning of the word would change? It's completely fine if we don't have any responses. This is a really hard thing to grapple with because we are taught that poetry is language, is words, is the way we construct it. Here we're telling you that the words don't matter. That is a completely different view of poetry itself, but it's something that can go in line with what you've been taught and what you know of poetry and prose.
Can I just toss in? Another question would be, what if there was a line break? What if the space around the page was exactly the same, but the line was just split across two? What if there was a line break after the third word, after the fifth word? What would that choice tell you? Why is it on one line? These are questions that we can be thinking about.
Once again, there's no need for an answer, but if you have one.
I think when the words were there, if they'd been split onto two lines, it would lose that sense of somebody just blurting something out. But without any words, I don't know.
That's completely fine. That's completely true. Sometimes the words can very, very much shape what it is that you're trying to say. And to abstract that and to remove meaning from it is incredibly difficult. Think about poetry in translation. When you have a piece in its original language and you don't speak that language, can you still get something from that piece, even if it is written?
Is it almost like, I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to be honest. Is it almost like, so the difference between reading a book to like watching a film is like when you're reading a book you paint your own picture of the character and you sort of fill in the details in your own mind. Is it kind of like that? It's the unwritten kind of version.
I think there's something to that for sure. Yeah, Greg, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to prose versus film and TV, as you've just said, something as simple as a line of dialogue, when you're reading it, you're setting the pace. you are the one who is deciding how quickly the character says each line, whereas in film and TV, that's the decision of the actor. And something as minor as that, if you extrapolate it across the entire story, you're absolutely spot on. And that can come into our poetry as well. If I was to flip back to where we had the meaning of the words, just to give this example, imagine the line break came just before the word children, and it instead became, if I were to read it aloud and try and translate that effect into audio, it's just, I feel sad you'll never have children. Is that meaningfully different to all of it being on one line? That's for you to decide.
And there's a bit of a crossover there with sort of the performance aspect of it, is that when you're reading the poem, even in your head, you kind of become a performance poet just for yourself. So even though there isn't a gap for this one between pear and strawberry, you might put one in there when you read it. Which is just something to think about, I suppose.
I think all of these things are really important things to think about. This is a very, very large concept that we cannot hope to cover in an hour and a half workshop here. But what we want is for you to start thinking about these things. What we want for you is to start considering the space around the page, the space around the words, what's left unsaid. That's what we'd really like for you to start thinking about. So any questions that you have from this, take them, think about them, discuss them. It is a large topic, but it's something that I think will infinitely improve your writing and also your comprehension of other people's work. So we do have some more examples for you here to go through. So this next one we have here, we're going to be showing everyone here. We will also be releasing a document that will be emailed out to attendees who've signed up, and we'll be putting it on our own Instagram accounts as well, so you can read through and have a look through the examples if you are tuning in at home through the broadcast or the live stream. So this example is a piece that we have converted to this language we've created from this, with the pears and the apples and the strawberries. And it reads, pear, 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 apple, 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 pear, strawberry, pear, apple, pear, strawberry, pear, apple, pear, apple, pear, apple, pear, 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 apple, pear, apple, pear, 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 strawberry, pear, pear, apple, pear, pear, pear. So, this is the piece. We have the first 4 lines written up for you right here. So, for anyone who cannot see, it's the first 4 lines of the piece I have just read in the language we've created of pears. Looking at this, and hearing the piece and seeing the piece, is there anything that jumps out to you straight away? Is there anything that you think possibly could be connoted by this, or any tones or any imagery that it creates to you? Yeah, of course.
This might just be my brain, but I went into some kind of surreal little world where there's someone in a supermarket just going round and round and pointing and just almost taking themselves into some kind of meditation. And even though those are just fruits, I already started making images, which I think is really brilliant.
No, I think that's wonderful. I think it is a wonderful, wonderful thing that can happen just from rhythm and just from spacing on the page, just from the space that we put around words. When the words don't have meaning, can we still evoke meaning? So, Greg and Alex.
I want to build on what you've just said there, speaking on the sort of meditative rhythm that the repetitive pairs create. And when that's broken up, obviously not on the first 4 lines that we're quite focusing on right now, but later on in the poem when it's broken up with a 2-syllable apple and a 3-syllable strawberry, it got me thinking, what was the effect of that specifically? And I haven't quite figured out how I feel about that, and I was wondering if anyone else had any ideas.
If anyone would, in the room, would like to come up and have a better look at the full Fruit translated poem, because we do appreciate it's kind of difficult to do an on-the-page workshop that is mostly spoken, because it's such a different effect, because like seeing the poem itself, even before you get to the words, just seeing the shape of it does something in itself that is very difficult to convey with just speech, which is exactly the point of the workshop, is that we can't convey this shape into words.
I think something that hasn't been quite mentioned yet is that the first line of the poem does not start at the top left of the page, which is standard for English writing. It starts right in the middle of the page, just below the title. And then each subsequent line starts further left, so that by and large for the first few lines, that middle of the page is the end of a line, not the start of it. And that's in itself quite backwards to how we typically would write.
But jumping in on our beautiful bit of audience participation here, thinking about the fact that it evoked a kind of meditative journey around a supermarket, the spacing and the format and the layout starting in the center of the page and slowly traversing its way across the page and then back over really does evoke that sense of movement and journey. We are left thinking, what is in between the start of the page, where we traditionally would start in the top corner, and the center? Where have we moved to start the poem? Why are we starting the poem there? And why are we wandering over backwards? And why are we moving as we go? The space, what is left unwritten, is just as important as the words themselves we're finding over and over again. So before we reveal the actual poem, Alex, did you say anything else?
Also, not just the where the poem's going, but the very edges of the poem, most of the words are isolated. Like they're almost not supposed to be there, like they've kind of drifted off slightly, which for me, it also tells you the type of movement they're trying to convey. It's not just like we're going in this direction, it's we're going in this direction, but maybe we didn't intend to. And maybe we sort of floated there accidentally. It's not a perfect shape, which I think is important, because you get a lot of poems that are, this is supposed to be in the shape of a tree, or this is supposed to be in the shape of a mouse's tail, but this is not that. This is trying to give you the hint of an image to see what you get from it. It's not so obvious as, here is a tree.
For me, seeing the poem on the laptop, that the space around it suggests sky or air, and I can see. I thought first about two swallows or swifts, but the more I look at it, the more it looks like planes, and the individual words could be bombs.
I think that's spot on. I also noticed a general bird-like shape. And I say general because, as Alex has quite rightly said, it's not perfect. One of the wings, as you like, is trailing off, and as you've just described, something falling from it, whether it's bombs from a plane, whether it's feathers from a bird, or anything else you can imagine flying through the air. It conveys that same sense of going on a journey and maybe leaving something behind along the way. And that's being conveyed. I will be entirely honest, I've been looking at it and it says pears. I've forgotten what the original words are, but I've still got this meaning in my head. So going back and looking at it again with that meaning returned, will I have a different idea of the poem? Will I have a deeper version of the same poem? I'm not sure, I haven't looked at it yet.
So should we do that right now? Alex, would you like to show everyone the poem, and Greg, would you like to read the poem to the people?
I would. Our hands touch on the steps at the side of the stage. The sparks like an uprush of birds taking flight. We connect. Two routes converge, make a pathway. The beginnings of regrets are exciting and direct. I signal. I'm about to take off. She signals she's prepared to keep pace. It's time to change direction. We lean into the rhythm. Find a bar.
Thank you so much. Once again, we will be releasing a document with all of these poems that we're discussing right now, along with a brief transcript of what we're actually saying now online afterwards on our Instagram pages, and we'll pass it along to Chapel FM as well. So if anybody would like to see it or be reminded of it, we will be providing that. But how interesting that just from seeing the shape of the poem and hearing it, we got ideas about meditation, about journeys, about movement, and we also got the ideas of birds, which is actually in the text of the very poem. We can see the way that even when the meaning is taken from the words, we're still able to take that meaning. It may have sounded completely far out and completely abstract when we introduced the idea of this workshop, but you are living proof and examples of the fact that this works and the fact that poems are far more than what we include. What we don't include is just as important. The space around the page is just as important.
For those at home, the poem is Flight by Kai Tempest from their book Divisible by Itself and One.
What do you think? Are you surprised? Have you got any thoughts now we've actually revealed what the poem is? Once again, it's completely okay if you don't. This is a lot to take in and we're asking you to join in a lot. I think I was really surprised because I was given this as an example by one of the members of the workshop here before I'd actually managed to read the real poem. I saw the pair poem in the same way all of you did, and I had to go on my own journey of trying to figure that out. And I was surprised, but I was pleasantly surprised because my first thought was of the movement, just as yours was. My first thought was going on a journey. And I think in a lot of ways it is taking us on a journey. It's taking us on a journey of connection, of relationships, of an emotion. And I think that there's a beautiful thing that we can take from that. And I think that that surprise makes us think a little bit more and consider a little bit more when we're reading and when we're constructing our pieces, how to give that same effect to our readers. Do you have anything else to say on that piece?
That's a really good question. I think that it's the ending that really ended up striking me. If I could just take another little look at those words, please, Alex. I would appreciate that. Because, as I said before, it was like the wings almost of this bird that I'm seeing, one of them being bigger than the other, and it ends up being the find a bar line at the very end that almost creates that. But it's still made up of these single syllable words. So we do return to that simplicity. It's just almost complexity is found in more simplicity.
Completely. I think that's a really great point.
Having kind of read the poem a bit more, because I realise it is quite difficult to try and analyse a poem when you've only heard it. For me, when I first read it, the journey was the most important thing because it's describing a first meeting between these two people, and it kind of hints at the potential for what their journey could be, but it doesn't tell you exactly. Like it says there's regret. It describes them as birds taking flight, like there's a connection, but then we've got I'm about to take off. She signals she's prepared to keep pace, but we don't know if the author did take flight or if they decided to keep with it. And I think we did get a lot of that just from the shape of the poem, in how absent it is and how uncertain. And obviously, the words are an important factor. You can't have a poem without words, or can you? But seeing how they complement each other and how the shape and space changes the words themselves. You may find it interesting to have a look at the poem without the formatting. And we haven't done that today, but you might find it interesting to just see what you think of the words on their own, and if you think something is lost from that, and what is lost and what is changed.
Because I think what was important there that you mentioned was the sense of absence. And that is conveyed simply in the spaces between the words, in the gaps that are left between the words, particularly at the end of that poem, that really, really denote that. The way that the words are inset and the way the words are separated and the line breaks, that gives us so much. The white space and the way that the white of the page is used on the poem gives so much to the words that are already there. They're used in conjunction. They are so important. And once again, if you did look at it without any of the breaks, without any of the formatting, just as a solid bit of text, I think that you would be missing a lot from the piece. So we have one little interactive element here before we wrap up our page poetry section. What we have done here is we have created we've created an example poem using our very own little fruit language once again of pears and apples, and we have taken 4 lines from a poem and we have written it out, separating each word. So, once again, we will be sharing this online for anyone who would like to see. Can everyone in the audience right now see the table? If you would like to stand up, take a better look, you are more than welcome to do so. It's these words right here. So what we have is the title of the poem, Pear. Pear, 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 apple, pear, pear, apple, pear, pear, apple, pear, pear, pear. Pear, 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 apple, pear, 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 pear. Once again, it's nonsense. It's nonsense without any of the meaning. But the way that it's shaped may suggest some meaning. Can anyone think of anything that the poem's saying to them right now? Did you say that again, please?
Telling you off a bit and having a go at you a bit. I don't know, for some reason you forgot to buy the apples or pears from the shop. I don't know.
Ignoring that it says pears and apples and just the shape of the piece,
Yes.
Are you still getting a sense of being told off?
Yeah, a bit. That's what I got from it anyway. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. Perhaps it speaks to how long the lines are and the differences between the lengths of the lines.
I'm not going to sound daft here, but my parents call me Daniel when they're telling me off, so maybe that's where it comes from.
I love that. And I'm going to bring it back to the syllables. This is where my focus has clearly been in the length of each line and how the syllables of each word create that sense of space of a long word or a short word. And there are so many pairs in here, but then there's the occasional apple, and as you've just said there, Daniel, it's the same connection of it being almost this monotonous droning on, and that's how sometimes being told off can feel, just like, yeah, all right, get on with it, but pear, 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 and then occasionally it's an apple, and suddenly I'm listening.
Just for those at home, the way the poem is currently laid out is we've got a short 6-word line and then a line that's about twice the size, and then there's a gap for what we would assume is the next stanza, and then it's the same pattern again. So short line, big long line, then a next stanza, then short line, big long line again.
So, do we have anyone in the audience right now that would like to come out and have a play around with this poem and see if they can reformat it to change the way that the meaning is conveyed?
Literally just moving around the words, that's all you gotta do. Feel free.
I won't call you Daniel, I'm not telling you off. I did, it was funny.
Right. So I can put these however.
Yeah, just get your hands stuck in, shift them around, see if you can change the meaning by changing the word placement.
I think about starting off maybe just like with one word at a time, and then maybe building it up.
So we're creating a column of pairs right now.
And then making it like this.
But as the
apple.
column,
I think I've still got someone telling me off in my head because it's like.
as the column gets longer towards the bottom, it's getting wider. I feel like a sports commentator. This is beautiful.
Apple. Have we got any mangoes?
Oh, these are some risky moves that he's playing here. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Yeah, this is what I was thinking. So you kind of build it up like that, and then maybe just have a couple where it goes, even a space there. Are you allowed to do that?
Yeah, you can allowed to do anything.
Yeah, sort of thing. Maybe like that.
Can you talk us through any thoughts that you're having as to why you're putting the words there?
Pear, apple, apple, pear. It's almost like instructions or something like that, and it's someone trying to tell you, it's like, God, it's just give over. Don't need to hear it.
That's fantastic.
Okay, right, yeah.
Thank you so much, that's great.
Brilliant.
So-
Would anyone... Sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to move the leftover words just slightly, and we can see that it's been constructed with the title, one line reading pair, the next line reading pair, the next line reading pair, the next line reading pair, pair. The fifth line is pair, pair, apple. The sixth line is pair, 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 apple. And then we have a 2-line break, and then it reads pair, apple, pair, 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 pair. So we can see that the poem, the construction and the formatting on the table right now, or on the page as it would be, slowly increases as it goes, and then we experience a break, and then it starts slowly increasing again. Is there anything that you now think when you look at this or hear this that has changed the way that you're reading or taking meaning from this poem? I want Trim, don't worry.
Is it Dan?
Yeah.
No. When Dan was reading how he'd put the words, there was an energy, like a new energy. So it started off slow and then it really revved up. And for whatever reason, this is what surrealism does. In my mind, there was somebody coming out of a coma and saying certain words and then throwing in another word. And I could feel the excitement because they were coming up with a different word. And then they were saying even more words, you know, all at once. So there was an energy. And I could feel this energy in this room. It's where your brain goes is just bizarre, isn't it?
Completely. I think that sense of tension building is really, really inherent there in the way that it's been constructed. And I think it was really interesting how you took it from being something that was somewhat monotonous or even being told off, as we said, to being something where there is a level of excitement and there is progression with the piece just from playing around with the way that it's shaped. And we look at that and we look at the fact that the gaps between each of the lines and the page are decreasing as we go forward, and we're seeing more of the words filling up that space and more of the white space being taken away and encroached upon by those words, and it's giving importance and energy to the words that are laid out there. Even if they don't have meaning, the space around is impacting them. I think that was a wonderful example of it, and you did a really great job doing that, because it is hard to do when the words don't have meaning. How do you construct a poem? And you've just done that, and you've given it meaning to somebody. It's a wonderful thing.
You could give it a different sort of meaning by just reciting it, but with intonation, as though you were telling a story and reading it out loud. So you could change that totally instead of doing it monotone by going up and down a bit.
Completely. In the second half of this workshop, we'll be talking a little bit more about performance and spoken word. And I think that there's something that Alex said earlier about the fact that when we read a poem in our own heads, we become our own performance poets. We perform it in different ways depending on what emphasis we are placing on each word and the tension we are giving it and the intonation and everything else. But I think that there is something inherent in the way that page poetry is written down that means it's all read in a similar sort of way. Otherwise, why would we give shape to words on a page? Why would we bother thinking about it at all? Because it does influence your reader. It does impact them. I think there's something really, really important in the fact that the eyes read first, which sounds silly, but we as humans are visual creatures. We look first. If you look at a painting, something on a page, a website, etc., you see it first. That visual impact is the first thing to hit you. And then you'll read the words. Then you'll look at the finer details. Then you'll give context to what you're seeing. And that all evokes meaning, and that all influences what you see from it. But the visual thing is the first thing. So the way that the poem is constructed on the page is the first thing you're going to get from the piece. You then read it. You then get meaning. You then put in the intonation and everything else as you read it. So we really, really have to consider the way it looks on the page. And that means considering the space around the page and what's left unsaid. Was there anything on this, Alex and Greg, before we wrap up this section of the workshop?
I was having a little bit of fun while you were just talking there. Apologies for having fun. But I took the remainder of the words that our good friend Dan didn't use, and I ended up messing around with them a little bit myself, and found that because of the nature of the little pieces of card that we had, they didn't necessarily have to line up in perfect lines. And so I created sort of a cluster. This is going to be one of my favorite sentences I've said today. I created a cluster of pears around an apple. And then below it, I created a line of pears. And I was thinking, without any idea of what those words could be replaced with if we were to give them meaning, I was thinking, right, so what's happening here is I've not got a set of lines, I've got a ball. I've got a ball of words in the middle of the page, and then at the bottom, I have a sentence or a line of text. And just as I'm looking at it now, I was thinking, what I've still done, though, is I've still put those words horizontally, so you can still read them regularly if you're looking at the page. But what if I changed that? What if I went over now and rotated them so they were facing in different directions? And I do apologize to any publisher who tries to work with me in the future for that kind of nonsense, but what if I just mix things up a bit? Not necessarily even vertical, but just a bit of diagonal, a bit higgledy-piggledy. What kind of effect would that have? What if instead of a line of a poem, I instead had a circle with no clear beginning or end, an almost Ouroboros of pears? God, I love the words that I'm saying right now. Thank you. Those are just my thoughts that I just had now.
I think that's all really, really important and all really interesting to think about. I think experimentation is potentially the most crucial part of this. When we speak about this topic, there's obviously a lot of various pieces of literary terminology that go along with it. We can talk about line breaks, enjambments, caesuras, open verse, stanzas, etc. But as we said at the start of this workshop, we don't think you need to know all that. We don't think you need to be able to grapple with all of that technical language. We are people with various degrees of literary knowledge, different master's degrees and creative writing degrees, teaching, etc. And yet, I think some of the best writers and poets I know are people who haven't been trained in all that. But feel free to experiment, to play, who aren't constrained by particular structure, who allow themselves to see the space on the page as somewhere free and embrace that freedom and use it. So if you have a piece you love, but you feel is stale or falling flat at all, try playing with the spacing of the words on the page. Employ the space as a piece of the poem. Think about it as another tool for your toolkit in writing, just as you think about metaphors or vocabulary or punctuation or different forms of literary skills. Think about the white of the page. It's time to get creative and playful with it, utilize it, and if you'd like, cut out your lines and your words and actually do this technique with them. Maybe once or twice, just to really get yourself into the rhythm of it. Do it on a Word doc if you'd like. Do it physically if you'd like. Just feel free to experiment and embrace new techniques for writing beyond what you may have been told or educated in, and beyond just getting your notebook out and writing a block of text. Do you have anything else you'd like to say, Alex?
So I was just going to say that the poem in its original format was another Kai Tempest poem called Flood, and it was just those 4 lines. That's the whole poem, and I can read it. I thought it was really interesting when Dan said that it felt like you were getting told off.
Sorry, Alex, could you raise the mic up to yourself a little bit?
Apologies. I thought it was really interesting that Dan said when Caitlin read it earlier that it felt like he was getting told off by the format of the poem, because that's what I feel in the poem. So I'm just going to read it for you. So, Flood. What scope is there for hope? We wonder with our slogans worn like collars at the throat. Noah stood back from the boat, drowning in the doubt that his own hands could make it float.
That's so great. We're going to leave you to think a little bit about that and about this. We're going to have a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with our spoken word section of this workshop, where we'll be talking about performance and the way in which the gaps around the words before and after the poem all have an impact, just as it does with the page poetry. So we'll see you after a 5-minute break. Hello and welcome to the second part of this spoken word, this workshop, which will be the spoken word section. I'm mixing up my own words here now. Firstly, let's start off this section by stating that not every poet has to be a performance poet. It's totally fine if you don't care about reading your work, if you're not interested in becoming a spoken word artist, or if when you read, you just want to sit down and read it as it's written. These are all completely fine things. There is a difference between being a spoken word artist, being a performance poet, and being a poet. You can be all of them. You can be a mix of them. You can just be one. But just because spoken word is having a massive moment in the UK right now, and there's a lot of events that cater specifically to spoken word and performance poetry, does not mean that has to be your thing. But we're going to talk a little bit about performing pieces, and we're going to talk a little bit about pieces that can become performance pieces as well. And I think that it's an art form like any other, and it may not fit your work, just like how every visual artist is not meant to be a painter. Alex has added a lovely little bit here saying you wouldn't ask a sculptor to paint the Sistine Chapel, and I think that's very, very true.
Except for the fact that a sculptor literally did paint the Sistine Chapel, but we're going to pretend that Michelangelo wasn't quite so talented.
Alex is correct in every way. So the actual practice and skills related to performing are very different to those related to writing. So if it's not your thing, that's fine. It also requires practice and dedication and talent and effort put into it, just like any other skill would. You can't expect to pick up a paintbrush and be the next, give me a great painter.
Picasso.
There you go. You have to spend the time and put the time in. And with spoken word artistry and with performance poetry, a lot of people perhaps neglect that. And they believe that it's something that comes inherently, because if you can speak, then you can read, then you can perform. When in reality, it takes a lot of thought and consideration. And with that, some pieces aren't meant to be performed, and that's okay. Some pieces exist best on the page, and that's okay. Some pieces are screaming out for you to perform them, and they are written with that in mind. Some pieces shouldn't even live on the page, and they just live in voice notes and in your notes app because you only want to read them and record them. All these things are fine, and you should never pressure yourself to do one or the other. With all this being said, this isn't regarding the space around the page in the same way as we've just spoken about. It cannot be. How can you translate the space on the page to a performance? You can do it with pauses. You can do it with the time spent before and after the poem. You can do it with emphasis on the words, but it's all going to come across differently. And so this is a different skill set, which is what we'd like to discuss in this little section. So it may sound confusing and hard to get your head around, so stick with us. We said this in the first half, and I think you all managed to stick with us and enjoyed that, so get ready for this one. When you're reading a piece, you make intentional decisions about pauses, spacing, pace, and rhythm. How long before you start, the space you leave out after you end, and the intentional breaks between lines, and even the breaths you take between the lines and the words. It all helps to construct the emotions and tone of the performance, allowing the audience to get a better sense of what you're saying to convey the piece. Greg, would you like to read out this example?
I would love to read out this example. Nothing would make me happier, in fact. If you're reading a piece about mourning and grief, then you may choose to stress pauses and what is missing. If you're reading a piece about secrets, then before building up to a climax and a revelation, you may take time to allow your audience to slowly digest what you're saying, to add anticipation. What you're not writing and what you're not saying adds as much to the piece as the pieces themselves.
So for us, this is a skill, and this is something that takes time to learn and to consider. And it's something that spoken word artists really need to get a handle on and to learn and to separate from the page. So what we'd like to show you now is a page piece that is performed as a spoken word piece by our very own Alex Callaghan. And it's a piece called Chainsaw Haircut. So they'd like to perform a little bit for you now.
So this piece is called Chainsaw Haircut. I'm just going to read the first section of it. In the barber's, all the doors are shut.
See, they're coming in for a haircut, and distantly there's a snare hit. It's remiss of me to remember it, but there was darkness on the moors on the night of the chainsaw haircut.
So once again, we'll be releasing the document with all of our little transcripts and our examples from this, so you'll be able to see the way in which that is formatted on the page, because it also does very much use the space around the page, as once again, it is both a page piece and a performance piece. And you'll be able to understand the way in which Alex was able to translate that by adding in the pauses and the space and the breath. But also, there's a whole separate art to that with the intonation that they added in, with the way in which they stressed and placed emphasis on specific words and lines. All of that goes to constructing a piece that can really convey the meaning and intonation that you're trying to do. So, what did you notice the most about that piece, and what were your impressions of the first few lines of Chainsaw Haircut? Does anyone have anything they'd like to share? It's the lovely James.
Well, it was good, of course. That's the main important thing. Very eloquently spoken, and you were right where you needed to be with that microphone. Some people get that very wrong.
If you'd like a little reminder, last year at Writing on Air, I held a performance workshop regarding the use of microphones, because that is something that people do forget about very, very much when it comes to spoken word, and is another part of the skill set that we all need to learn when we're performing poetry. But yes, Alex is incredibly, incredibly crafted when it comes to performing poetry, and it is with practice. Alex, is there anything in particular you were thinking of with that performance that you'd like to share?
That's a good question, one I probably should have thought about. I think for me it's quite a fragmented poem, and it's almost like a parody of kind of thriller and horror type, not necessarily poetry, but writing. So it being a very kind of gradual build-up was quite important for me. And so I wanted to show that in the fractured way that it's spoken. It's an interesting one in reference to how it's written on the page as well, because when I originally wrote it, it was just, in the barbers, all the doors are shut, see they're coming in for a haircut, and distantly there's a snare hit, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was only after reading it a few times that I broke up the lines, because it sounded more like what I was wanting. So, in the barbers, all the doors are shut. See, they're coming in for a haircut. And again, playing around with the speed of each line, especially with all the doors are shut, I always do that quite quickly. Because, almost like to reflect the words themselves, because you've shut the door quickly, because they're coming in for the haircut.
Can I extend on what you're saying? So something I find quite helpful when I'm teaching my students and they're struggling to put into words their decisions with their writing is, I know there's no right or wrong with this, but if you'll forgive me the use of the word wrong, I think it'll help us. Could you please, just the first 4 lines, we don't have to do the whole thing, could you please read it wrong?
How wrong do you want? In the barbers, all the doors are shut. See, they're coming in for a haircut. It's remiss of me. I've lost a line. I did it very wrong. I'll try that again, shall I? In the barbers, all the doors are shut. See, they're coming in for a haircut. And distantly, there's a snare hit. It's remiss of me to remember it, but there was darkness on the moors on the night of the chainsaw hit.
Absolutely fantastic. And you did that so wonderfully. It added an element of comedy that I think is certainly not supposed to be there, or quite in that same way. And I think that's the thing that I want to give to all of our audiences, whether it's you here today, you on the other side of a speaker, or if you're just reading the document and watching this later, whatever it is, when you're trying to figure out the right way to do your poem, you can often come up against an invisible wall of like, oh, well, what is the right way? Who am I to even decide that? I'm struggling to put it into words now, but if you can go, well, I know what the wrong way is, you can cycle through a million wrong answers to find the right one. And it's something I tell my students, even the youngest ones, if they're like, oh, I don't know anything about Shakespeare, I don't know what Romeo was like, I'll be like, all right, Romeo was a horse. And they'll go, no, he wasn't. I'm like, perfect. Do that with your poem. Go, right, I'm writing a romantic poem. I don't know how to do it properly. I'll do it wrong.
I think that's some really, really great advice right there. Thank you so much for sharing that, Greg.
I think there's an interesting thing to think about for the process of writing a poem like this, because a lot of my stuff is quite rhythmic. And sometimes I know what it sounds like before I've written it. So almost like what we were talking about before, like you see the shape of the poem before you actually read anything. It's like I have a rhythm in my head and I have to find the words that will fit that rhythm, which I don't think was the case for this poem, but quite often is for a lot of other very rhythm-based performance poetry.
Which once again brings me back to the point of there is a difference a lot of the times between page poetry and performance poetry or spoken word pieces, where in a lot of those cases the rhythm and the performance of the piece is prioritized a little bit more over the construction and technicalities of the language. We're thinking more about how it's going to sound audibly, how we can perform it, how can we have the best effect when we're actually reading it aloud, rather than on the page what's going to look the best, or on the page what is the cleverest way to be able to do this and to construct it. It's a different form, it's a different art style, and it's something that definitely needs to be considered. You can write a piece and you can perform it, and you can do so using these techniques and using these skills that makes it a great performance piece, or you can construct it with that in mind. And when we're thinking more about what's left unsaid and the space around the words, I think that's really important, because you're building from that. You're building from what you're not going to do. You're building knowing, I want this to have this dramatic pause here. I want this to slowly reach this crux and this climax. And I would like to leave a soft pause here. And I would like to smash that line out here really, really abruptly and really, really harshly. And then I want it to stop. And I want there to be a moment of reflection right at the end as the poem finishes, because I want that to be the most important thing. And then the words follow, or the piece follows after that, because you've built it with what's left unsaid being the most important thing there. And if it's not the most important thing, it's definitely a really big part of it. What's left unsaid is as important as what is said, once again here.
A great example is the limerick. When you write a limerick, you start knowing what a limerick is, you know the exact rhythm, you know what you're going to have to fit in. And you might decide to subvert that, people quite often do with the last line. That's the fun in a limerick, is that you're playing around with this form that already exists, which also links back to what we were saying right at the beginning of you might start with some sort of structure or form that is more specific, like a limerick. And that's the same for performance poetry as it is for page poetry.
Great addition there, Alex. Wonderful. So we have another little activity for our workshop attendees right now, and it's something that you can also try at home, either now or later on. We have given you, just behind Greg, right here, 4 lines from this poem, Chainsaw Haircut by Alex Callaghan. We've also got it written down on some card for you here, and we'd like to invite a few members of the workshop right here to come forward to these microphones and to read those lines in whatever way, in the most effective way you see best. Do we have anyone here that would be interested in doing so? Of course, come forward.
Yeah. But there was darkness on the moors on the night of the chainsaw haircut.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who would like to come out and try that? James, come on.
The more unique you can do this, the better almost.
Experiment.
But there was darkness on the moors on the night of the chainsaw haircut.
Yes.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to come out and give that a go? Gregory?
I'll do. Sorry, I was passing the microphone to Alex, but you know what? I will do it. But there was darkness on the moors on the night of the chainsaw haircut.
Stunning, stunning. I think you can see all of those three performances were so different. The exact same words, the exact same lines from the exact same poem. And I feel like we got a different sense from each and every one of them, a different tone, a different feeling, a different emotion, and we took different meaning from those words just because of the way they were performed, and not even just from the intonation, the pacing, the space, what was left unsaid between and after the words. It all had an impact on it. And you can do this with your own poetry, you can do this with other people's, you can practice with it, and you can see what works best. Once again, it takes experimentation, and it takes being brave enough to try different things to really get to grips with that. Before we go on to show you another example, do we have any questions about this? It's totally fine if we don't. You can feel free to message us afterwards to ask us any questions, or we'll ask again right at the end of this section, if that's okay.
I do want to just add something. One of the fun things about performance poetry for me is that even if one of you had come up and read it in what you thought was the exact same way that I did, it would still be a completely different and individual performance, down to the specifics of accent and dialect and tone of voice and pitch of voice, which is really cool. That's pretty cool, guys.
That's what I'm just going to keep building on. That's what I think makes spoken word, as we said earlier, so different from page poetry, in that page poetry is concrete, it exists, and, save a fire or the inevitable passage of time, it will just exist in that way, in the same way, forever. But every time we perform a piece, that same piece on a different day, at a different place, in a different way, it comes alive as a different poem. Same words, but we're doing it differently.
And there's something to be said there about audience as well, is that while you're writing a poem, until you show it to someone or it gets published, the only interpretation of that poem will be your own. And that is the same for the meaning as well as the space behind the words and everything to do with that poem. And the moment that poem goes somewhere else, there's now millions and millions, well, depending how many people you've got reading it, but there's now like an infinite number of different versions of that poem, in how they're being read in people's heads, how they're being read out loud. Quite often I find if I'm reading a poem in my head and then I read it out loud, I will do it quite differently. Partly because when you're reading it in your head, you don't have to squeeze in all the syllables. You maybe skim through some of it. But yeah, there's something interesting there to be said about the audience and who's seeing the poem and who's reading it and who is taking what from that poem that you might not have even seen when you were first writing it.
Yes, of course. Greg, if you mind. Oh, I'll do it.
Is there a point where the performance kind of overtakes the words, and does it matter?
I think that then gets a very, very difficult question with a lot of different answers there. It's a very good one, but it's very difficult. Because for me, particularly, performance poetry is something that adds to the piece, or it exists separately from the piece. Your performance is its own art. In the same way, if I did a poem about a painting, it would not be a reflection of the painting. It would be a very, very separate piece. Each performance of a poem I do is a performance of that poem rather than a poem itself or the poem itself. They become separate things. Does that make sense? And so I think that sometimes the performance can overshadow the poem in many ways. And it may become something that you're known for more, or something that is more essential and reflective of your practice than the piece itself, the performance of it. But I think that the poem still exists. The piece still exists. And I think the performance, if anything, yes, it does become its own separate thing, but it exists to highlight that craft and that piece and the construction of the poem. It exists to elevate it to new forms and to transform it into a new piece. So the core of the performance is still the poem. The core of it is always going to be the work itself. And without that solid base and that understanding of craft, the performance isn't going to mean anything. As well as you can read and as well as you can use language and as well as you can express yourselves, without the actual great poem, what are you doing?
But also with writing with the intention for performance, because Chainsaw Haircut is on page and a performance poem, I would say. But some poems are made purely for performance. So when you're writing down the words, you might already know that they're not important. And Caitlin has a great poem called Step Aerobics. And the way that Caitlin performs it is very fast. And it's like up, up, down, down, and it's fast. You're not supposed to catch all of it. The speed of it is more important than the writing itself. And that's not to say it's not a wonderfully crafted poem, but the craft is also in the performance of it.
But I think with Step Aerobics, because the piece is about a eating disorder, and it was constructed so each line is 10 syllables long, and there is a loose rhyme within it, and there is metaphor, and there is thought carefully placed in all of the language. But yeah, the performance is a part of it, because I wanted to reflect the pace and rhythm or the frenzy of a mental health crisis and the actual act of Step Aerobics itself, which is a core part of the piece. But I don't think the words are unimportant. The words are still important. And it wasn't written intentionally as a performance piece. It was written intentionally for people to read with that speed, with that frenzy, with the thoughts of the actual act in mind.
I think just because I've only heard it as a performance piece, I wasn't saying the words aren't important. They are, of course, important. But there's an extra element there. Like the moment Caitlin first performed that poem, it gained a different kind of life.
The poem's still there, it's still very important, and without it, the performance would mean very little. But we use the performance to give it new life, to create it a new art, a new piece from it. Both the performance piece exists and the poem exists, but without a good basis of the poem, maybe the performance becomes more well-known, maybe it's something that's appreciated more, but I don't think it overshadows it, because it requires it to be there. Does that answer your question? We could talk about this all day. It's a really interesting topic, and we could talk about spoken word, but to return back to what's left unsaid, and to return back to our topic for this workshop before we wrap up, I just wanted to read one piece for you in two different ways. So it's going to be an extract from a piece from my chapbook that Alex actually picked out for me for this specific workshop, because they felt like it reflected what we were trying to say the best. So I am going to read a piece from Now Say It Back called Love. And I'm going to read a little extract. I'm going to read it without the spacing that I would normally give it, without the thoughts behind what's left unsaid. And then I'm going to read it how I would usually read it. And we'll see what you think about the difference. I don't know what love is, but I've been in it. I've felt it. I've had it given to me. I'm terrified of it, but I cannot let it go. I don't know what love is, but I think it's absurd comfort in haphazard occupation, the familiar, tender sustenance, finding protection in the burgeoning contamination, being momentarily vulnerable in the ever-taking, indestructible bliss. I don't know what love is, but I think it is this. And for the actual way. I don't know what love is, but I've been in it. I've felt it. I've had it given to me. I am terrified by it, but I cannot let it go. I don't know what love is, but I think it's absurd comfort in haphazard occupation, the familiar, tender sustenance, finding protection in the burgeoning contamination, being momentarily vulnerable in ever-taking, indestructible bliss. I don't know what love is, but I think it is this. Thank you. So, this leads us to the conclusion of our Words Left Unsaid workshop. The last thing we wanted to say is thank you so much for tuning in and being part of What We Don't Include. We hope that you can take something from this, and we've given you something to reflect upon in your practice. Thank you so much to Chapel FM and Writing on Air for giving us the space to have this discussion for What We Don't Include, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the festival. Later on, just after us, Yaffle Press are doing a wonderful, wonderful event. You should all stay here, stay tuned in, keep listening. Tune in now if you're not, though I don't know how you'd hear that message. And enjoy everything that's coming, because it really is my favourite time of the year. There's so much joy and so much love in the Leeds literary community around this time, and I think it's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. Next week, on the 1st of December, the three of us will be back for some very fun events. We will be doing a radio show from Bone Down LAG all about secrets. And we're going to be talking about the things people don't say and what's missing from those conversations. And then we will be with Bentkey Publishing talking about Northern writing and the fact that us Northerners tend to be a little bit missing from the literary scene. And it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful time. Greg and Alex, thank you so much for joining me. Did you have anything left to say?
Just for the people in the room, if you would like to come up afterwards and have a look at any of the examples that we've talked about, we have, ones we talked about today and some others that are excellent examples of page poetry that has interesting shapes. One that I would specifically mention that if you're at home, and you should definitely check them out, is The Body in Its Seasons by Maz Hedgehog. Maz does this really interesting thing where they use footnotes within their poetry, but when they perform it, they don't read the footnotes, which I think is so interesting. But for anyone interested in page poetry, I would definitely recommend this. To just see what they do on the page. It's incredible. That's it from me.
I think poetry's all right, to be honest.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.